This podcast is made possible through listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina and the Florence County Museum, presenting Edward Gay, an American landscape painter, chronicling Gay's evolving style amid the turn of the 20th century and his unique connections to South Carolina and the National Academy of Design, now through February 23rd. FlocoMuseum.org. And Meadow Garden, home of George Walton, one of the youngest signers of the Declaration of Independence. Open for tours Monday through Friday, 10 to 4. Learn more at historicmeadowgarden.org and visit augusta.com.
From South Carolina Public Radio, this is Walter Edgar's Journal. I'm Walter Edgar, welcoming you to our podcast series about South Carolina culture and history, with a nod to all things Southern. This week, Alfred Turner and I will be talking with Dr. Kendra Hamilton, author of Romancing the Gullah in the Age of Porgy and Bess.
Hamilton's book is a literary and cultural history of a place, the Gullah Geechee Coast, a four-state area that's one of only a handful of places that can truly be said to be the cradle of black culture in the United States.
While there is a veritable industry of books on literary Charleston and on the lowcountry, there has never been a comprehensive study of the region's literary influence, particularly in the years of the Great Migration and the Harlem and Charleston Renaissance. With Romancing the Gullah, Kendra Hamilton sheds new light on an only partially told tale. Dr. Hamilton, welcome to the Journal. I'm really looking forward to talking about your book, Romancing the Gullah in the Age of Porgy and Bess. How about telling us what you mean by the title?
Well, what a great question to start with. And first of all, thank you so much for having me here. I'm absolutely thrilled, having been a fan of the show for a really long time. But the idea behind the title, Romancing the Gullah, is that so much of what we know about Gullah and Gullah Geechee culture is the product of fantasy and romance. There's not a whole lot of fact. And so I'm trying to put both in balance because I'm interested in artists, and of course artists are interested in fantasy. But I'm also trying to say, no, these are not real Gullahs. These are literary Gullahs. Let's be straight about what the distinction is.
You start off and explain very clearly about the Charleston Renaissance, the term that refers to the artistic and literary production predominantly by white South Carolinians between the end of World War I and the beginning of World War II.
Yes.
And that's the phrase that's used now by art historians and literary critics. It's called the Charleston Renaissance. DuBose Hayward,
Julia Peterkin, Alice Ravenel, Hugh G. Smith, the painter, and many people like that, yes.
You start off with a book that they published, explains it all, called The Carolina Lowcountry.
Yes, yes.
And you want to talk about that for just a minute?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think that most people, when they think about this period, the Charleston Renaissance, they think about DuBose Hayward. You know, they think about his novel Porgy, which went on to become a Broadway show and then an opera. Some people know about the art, but the book that the Carolina Lowcountry was a book that all the different groups that were part of the Charleston Renaissance, the preservationists, the artists, the writers,
the society,
the musicians, the Society for the Preservation of Spirituals, all those people came together to talk about what they thought was worth preserving about their culture. And so there are all these essays that are about history, and then there's a huge section of African-American spirituals, Gullah spirituals, that were from the period of their childhood.
One of the organizations was the Poetry Society of South Carolina.
Of which I'm a member.
Yeah. And so was Gene Toomer.
That's right.
Okay, and who is Gene when he's home, or was?
Gene Toomer was an African-American writer. His publication, Cain, was a great success, and the Poetry Society had an annual publication, and it cited members' accomplishments. Well, he had joined the organization from afar, and he said, well, I published Cain, and all of a sudden the Poetry Society in Charleston realized they had an African-American member.
It was a book, the reviews said that it was a thrilling book by a Negro about Negroes. And, the members, John Bennett, who was one of the founders, along with DeBose Hayward, had kittens. He was really, he had already survived a scandal in Charleston where, he was a folklore collector and a storyteller. He'd read a short story to a group of preservationist ladies. It was called Queen Margot, which was about an African-American, I believe she was a seamstress, who struck a deal with the devil that her daughter would be allowed to pass for white. And the whole idea of passing was so controversial and so verboten, especially in the presence of ladies, that John Bennett was not received for 10 years. He was not, even though he was married to, into a very prominent family, he was not.
Well, the Poetry Society, not its founding, but its first yearbook, in the introduction, they are a reaction to Mencken's Sahara of the Beaux-Arts essay, which said between Virginia and Georgia, there's a vast wasteland. And
cultural wasteland.
A cultural wasteland.
Mm-hmm. Not a first-rate book or a first-rate sympathy or a first-rate anything.
And he quoted an author from Richland County who had a quotation, "Alas for the South, their books are fewer. They're not much given to literature."
Boy.
But he did spark an entire cultural revitalization movement all over the South just by virtue of that very, poorly received critical article about our cultural production.
And in the process, whether it was writing, whether it was painting, they deliberately created an image of the Low Country, which first appears together in that book, The Carolina Low Country. It goes along with the popular mythology of the day of a land of monuments and memories, faded, a world that was either dead or dying. And they're talking about the Old South.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Scarlett O'Hara's world. Of course, Charlestonians would have said they were far above anything that Scarlett O'Hara was.
Exactly. That low-class Georgia girl.
Well, I mean, after all, Rhett Butler said he was going back to Charleston where there was culture.
Where there was still some culture left, yes.
And so that image became accepted really by not just white South Carolinians, but the rest of the artistic world.
Yes, very much so. I mean, this whole period, many of the artists who were attracted, the white artists who were attracted to Charleston during this period, were, from other regions who had been in the habit of traveling to Europe for their refreshment and for their ideas. When World War I closed Europe off, they went around the country looking for alternatives. And so Alfred Huddy, who was one of the artists who became associated with the Charleston Renaissance, wrote his wife, "Come quick, have fun, heaven." And so this was the attitude that artists brought when they came to Charleston, when they were, quote unquote, from off.
Well, this was a Charleston that literally was pretty much in shambles. It was very shabby. This is pre-preservation. And it reminded them of European villages, and that was the atmosphere.
Yes, of ruins and of greatness, sort of passed away. And so they were. The art was very much concerned with the old buildings, but interestingly, these old buildings were always had in the frame these tiny African-American figures, which somehow spoke to, quote unquote, the glories of the past and, oh, how the mighty have fallen, that now, these former slaves are, the masters in their place.
Well, that brings to mind particularly Elizabeth O'Neill Verner.
Yes.
The flower ladies, or she would refer to the flower women with the bandanas.
Her iconic, famous images. And so it's fascinating when you look at the ways in which the art represents the African-American figure. Elizabeth O'Neill Verner is one of the few who actually gives these figures faces. Many times what you see is the African American, particularly in the works of Alice Ravenel, Hugh G. Smith, and Huddie. They're either in an urban setting or way off in the country, and they're so far in the distance, they're just sort of like a part of the landscape, right? Or with Huddie, even when he's showing his urban scenes, if you look closely at the faces, it's all the same face. There is this, caricatured sameness of expression. Verner actually gives her figures personality and individuality. These are women, like when she writes about them in her writings, it's Ruby talking, or it's, Sarah Jones, right? It's not just this sort of like figure off in the distance that is symbolic of the way of life we've lost, right? And she actually she was a huge advocate of the Jenkins Orphanage Band. And when, preservationists and segregationists were trying to basically run them out of the historic district, she was one of the people who spoke up for them and said, look, the Flower Ladies and the Jenkins Orphanage Band are part of our culture. When people come here, the first thing they look for is for these figures, and we should be embracing them. And of course, nobody listened to her. They got evicted from their quarters in the old Marine Hospital and went to North Charleston. And in fact, my family, I grew up a stone's throw away from the Jenkins Orphanage Band. My father played in the Jenkins Orphanage Band when he was a child. That's how he got his training as a jazz musician.
Well, people today forget that the Jenkins Orphanage Band was an international celebrity.
Yes.
They toured Europe. Command performances before royalty.
Yes. People don't know that, right? Mm-hmm. It has very modest surroundings now, but when Reverend Jenkins moved from the city, he idealized this idea of his children being able to be out in the country, to be able to breathe fresh air, to eat food that they had grown themselves, and to feed themselves from the river, because it's got a commanding spot right on the Ashley River, one of the most beautiful locations in North Charleston. And he was featured in Time magazine in 1930. And what the band was making at that time, $100,000 a year in tours, which was astonishing money.
Wow.
Astonishing money back at that time.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to literature. DuBose Hayward, obviously. Julia Peterkin.
Yes.
And then someone people don't really know, E.C.L. Adams.
Yes.
From Richland County.
Yes, from Richland County, the doctor. Mm-hmm.
Yes. And I was fascinated because your take on those white people writing about black people, they're using them, and the characters, particularly you're not very happy with the characters. But what I found fascinating is you say at one point their literary Gullah, the conversations that they write are among the best that appeared. And it was ironic that white authors had the ear to do that.
Right. Uh-huh.
And you also mentioned, which people don't talk about, is for many whites in the Lowcountry, Gullah was actually their first language.
Yes, that's poorly understood, but yeah, that's actually true. Many of the people who are in the Society for the Preservation of Spirituals, I mean, so the idea behind the Society for the Preservation of Spirituals is this: you had to be someone who had grown up on one of these plantations, in the Ace Basin, Ashahu, Combahee, Edisto Basin. Yeah. Generally, those were the places that definitely fed into this organization. And you couldn't be a professional singer. You had to be someone who had grown up with it in childhood, right? That was their whole shtick. And so they would dress in tuxedos and fancy gowns. And then they'd do a blackface performance without the blackface. They would sing in Gullah with the shouting and the hand clapping and the stomping. And they could sing so authentically that, for example, when the Smithsonian wanted, a Gullah Geechee expert, they came down and they asked Samuel Stoney instead of. It wasn't the Smithsonian. It was one of the New York institutions, and they could have gone to Hell's Kitchen, where all the Gullah Geechee people had migrated up and they were like living in Hell's Kitchen. You could have gone and talked to them, but they came all the way to Charleston to talk to Sam Stoney, who was in the Spiritual Society.
Well, the late George Rogers, my colleague at the University of South Carolina, referred to the famed Charleston accent as High Gullah.
Hi, Gullah. That's cute. I like that. I would like to return to that point that you made about Gullah being the first language of many whites in the Lowcountry. This is something that when we talk about Gullah Geechee identity, people have a very narrow sense of what that is. They think that it's a few people on a few sea islands, in South Carolina and Georgia. And what's not understood is that, South Carolina was the most important slave port during the colonial period. More people were imported through Charleston than any other. And so that makes us one of the sort of like original places where African American identity was formed. And it happened so long ago that people don't understand not just what Gullah has to do with African American identity, but what it has to do with American identity. So much of the tenses, the verb tenses from West Africa that sneaked in through the back door of Southern speech into American speech originated here. Foodways about, eating rice and the ways that you eat rice, these kind of like one-pot gumbo soups that take one form in South Carolina and a slightly different form in Louisiana, because of the influence of the French and those other and those things. The people don't understand how deeply embedded this stuff is in their own culture. We are Creole people. All of this stuff that we think is white, or we think is black, or we think is Gullah, or we think is this, there's this melding and blending. And I'm trying really hard to point out, these continuities deep in the past so that people can understand their present a little bit better.
Let's talk about the word Creole, because it has different meanings. Sometimes in Louisiana, it's supposed to be just someone who is European of French and Spanish influence. I grew up in Mobile, Alabama.
Oh, yeah.
And when the term Creole was used, it was generally used to persons of color of mixed race.
Right. So there's sort of accepted versions of what Creole means, and then there's the way people use it in real life. So I think the important distinction to make is somebody that's Creole is both native to a new place, native to the United States, and other. So when people in the past used Creole, let's say a Frenchman, from Paris, referring to a Creole from Louisiana, then that was somebody who of whatever color, who spoke the language, was native in that sense to a home culture elsewhere, but also was other because they were native also to this very new place and this new set of circumstances. So I use Creole in the broader sense, not in the sense that limits it to, white people, who were the first settlers from wherever. But because there are so many versions of this Creole, so much, or as they say in Latin American studies, mestizaje, where you're all this mixing and mingling.
Well, actually, all colonial settlements really were truly Creole, right?
Very true, yes, because they were native, but they were other. They were not European. They were this new thing. Something new was being created, and people realized or recognized that there were these differences, and there were some cultures that were very comfortable with them. The French and the Spanish, the main distinction in French and Spanish cultures was religion. Were you Catholic or not? If you were a practiced Catholicism and you spoke the language, then you had rights under the system. Anglo cultures were very uncomfortable with the racial mixing aspect of Creolite. So they tended to make very strong lines between people of different races and to try and slice and dice. well, we've got quadroons and octoroons and, all these these different times of variations that they're trying to make sense of. And what I'm saying is that, there's so much mixture going on in early South Carolina. Did you think about the counties in South Carolina that were 80% African American before the war? So those people were not unchanged by their encounter with the culture, right? With the other culture.
You do quote George Tillman, the brother of
I love that.
Pitchfork Ben Tillman, because in the Constitutional Convention in South Carolina, the State Constitutional Convention of 1895, they were talking about and putting in legal terms who was black and who was not. Most folks don't realize that prior to the Civil War, South Carolina did not define race. It depended upon the local community to accept whether somebody was black or whether they were white. So in 1895, era of Jim Crow, we're going to define who is a black person in South Carolina. Mm-hmm. And they were talking about one drop
of African-American
blood would make somebody
black.
And Tillman, he made the astounding claim there was not one pure-blooded Caucasian on the floor of the convention. Now,
and most likely an accurate claim.
Well, because he was saying that if you weren't mixed with black, you certainly were with Native American, right?
Yeah.
So,
I mean, it was astounding.
It was astounding.
They eventually settled on 1/8.
But yes, this was happening all over the South at the time, right? I remember when they passed it took 20 years more in Virginia. But I remember studying in graduate school the Racial Integrity Act of 1924 in Virginia and being astounded that this idea of this one drop rule being so recent in time, that we have this notion that these things were set up and it's been going for hundreds of years. And actually these rules, many of them that we live by are quite recent.
Well, one of the things that you stress, and I think it's really important, people say, Gullah's dying out. Mm-hmm. It's not dying out.
No, it's not. I think that among scholars, the search for a quote-unquote pure research sample, has been one of the prominent features of all of the 20th century criticism, that there has been a fear and a stress on the vanishing, the fact that it's a static culture, the fact that it's vanishing. And what I try to point out is that a culture that basically was the result of the melding of hundreds of African cultures over here in another process where it melded with European and Native American cultures and has spread all over the globe. There are pockets of Gullah speakers in Mexico and in Texas who were dispersed in that direction through the Seminole Wars, right? Gullah has cousins in Barbados, in Jamaica, in the Bahamas. So you can hardly call this global culture a static and vanishing culture. What you can do is try to figure out where all the connections are and see where that leads us in terms of our understanding of who we are as a people in the United States.
Well, it's interesting because to many in the African-American community up into the 50s, they were not supposed to talk Gullah. They were supposed to talk proper English.
The King's English.
And you address that too.
So I talk about, one of the things that is, because there is a cultural revitalization movement happening right now, many people are only familiar with the way Gullah was treated in the modern era, where it's a source of celebration and, there's all this activity in terms of research and conferences. And so people think, look at this wonderful culture, how may we preserve it? But if you grew up as a Gullah Geechee kid in the 60s and 70s, as I did, or in the 50s and 60s, as Clarence Thomas did, then you received very different messages about a broken language and broken English and shaming and disowning that in order to succeed, to have a decent life, you had to leave all of that stuff behind. You had to leave all those people behind, that there had to be this severing between you and the culture in order to achieve success. One of the examples that I use of that is Clarence Thomas, who grew up in Pinpoint, which is a little Gullah Geechee community in Moon River, the famous Moon River in Savannah, and who speaks often of his, we don't hear him often speak during oral arguments since he's been on the court. And one of the excuses that he uses is that growing up, he was given, shamed so much for his Gullah Geechee accent that he is still to this day reluctant to speak publicly. It's painful for him to speak publicly. And so I use Clarence Thomas's life, or our two lives, as contrast. He grew up in Savannah. I grew up in Charleston. We both went to Catholic schools that were, and were taught by Black nuns, segregated Catholic schools, and experienced integration and experienced discrimination in those Catholic settings. And he went one path. He was so teased especially by African American kids, because he moved into town after his house burnt down, and he moved into his grandfather's house in town and started going to a Catholic school in town where his nickname was ABC, America's Blackest Child. No one will admit to having, actually called him that, but everyone who was interviewed says, yeah, we remember that was his nickname. And so his antipathy toward African American causes has some pretty deep roots, and it's rooted in his shame over his Gullah Geechee identity. That is the argument that I make in that chapter.
All right. So were you taught that you should speak a certain way when
Absolutely, 100%. My parents, do you hear any trace of Gullah Geechee in my speech? Not really. When I'm home and I've been home a while and I'm around like family members and everybody's talking, then I'll slip back into it. It's like imprinted in me. But I also was trained that, I needed to have a network news voice if I wanted to, travel and go anywhere. And so I did. My parents sent me to the Dock Street Theater, where I was given elocution lessons and learned to. One of the things that the Dock Street Theater did at that time, and I was one of the first African-American kids to go to their theater school. But one of the things they specialized in was erasing Gullah from people, from, the elite Charlestonian speech. So they spent a lot of time teaching us to hear and sound out and to eliminate our accents.
Well, that's not peculiar to persons of color. White folks with accents, they're schools.
Right.
I think there's even one in Charleston. You can be trained to lose your Southern accent. It's got to be this flat Midwestern,
right?
Walter Cronkite, whatever.
And I think that's changed now, right? People are embracing their heritage. They're embracing their speech. They're embracing their cultures. But that still doesn't mean that there aren't consequences. If somebody shows up for a job at a fancy hotel in Charleston, the person with a very deep Gullah Geechee accent is likely not to be the one chosen. Right. So there is still that discrimination. I was trying to say, you're celebrating it on the one hand, but on the other hand, there is this, in schools, children are punished for speaking in certain settings. There is this embrace that you say is happening, it's not being felt on the ground.
And again, I quote the late George Rogers, who did his graduate work at the University of Chicago. He would basically be asked every now and then, in front of other professors, to talk Charleston,
Oh, yeah.
I mean, basically.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
He was a curiosity.
Talk Charleston for me. Can you speak Gullah for me? Oh, God. And in other parts of the world where there are these Creole language communities, you see that there are newspapers that the Creole language is used as a sort of scaffolding to teach the majority tongue, in school, that, it's taken seriously. Or there's a quote that I use that these Creole languages are part of the serious side of life. And here, not so much. It's interesting to me that the heyday among white writers of writing about this culture was almost 100 years ago. Whereas the many people who have written about the South and the Low Country in modern times, very few of the white writers have tried to capture the speech. The way I became interested in this through literary studies is that there's a really strong vein of Black women writers in the 60s, 70s, and 80s who were inspired by Gullah Geechee culture, folklore, folk tales, myths, particularly spiritual beliefs, and that these spiritual beliefs in particular are infused through a whole, stream of novels that were written during that period and that are still being written today, but though, in different genres. So what I would say is the initial book that I wanted to write was about, Toni Morrison using the myth of the flying African as the sort of centerpiece of Song of Solomon. I wanted to talk about Gloria Naylor using African-American traditional religious beliefs, the watch night service, also beliefs in boo hags and stuff like that, how she's infusing that into her fiction. There's Caribbean-American artists like Paul Marshall. There's a whole section of one of her novels that the epilogue takes place in St. Simon's Island. And the Ebo landing myth is central to several works. But what I discovered was that so little had been written or understood, or so much that had been written about Gullah Geechee culture was so partial and poorly researched and poorly understood. There was a whole bunch of people in the 1920s and 30s who were trying to figure stuff out and making folklore collections. And their conclusions were, basically racist. Then you get people like, with Peter Wood and Black Majority, Charles Joyner, Down by the Riverside.
Yeah.
Those books come out and they give us a really clear historical picture, but the historical picture is not translating into what is being written about literature. So I found that I had to create a context for people to be able to understand the books of the 70s. And so that's what drew me to this period during the between the wars. Because you've got two sets of artists. You've got these Charleston artists who are trying to prove to the world that, yes, we have culture. No, we are not the Sahara of the Beaux-Arts. We have this gift to give to the world. And at the same time, you have people like W.E.B. Du Bois, who is at that time living in Atlanta, working at the Atlanta University, doing his sociological studies of the Negro, which are some of the earliest sociological studies. And he's one of the founders of the field of sociology. And these studies are based around Darien. And this stuff starts working its way into his work. It's in Souls of the Black Folks. It's in his novels. He writes some novels that are that are studied in graduate school. Let's put it like that. They're important because he wrote them, not because they're good novels. But, and that led me to the Johnson brothers, James Weldon Johnson, who wrote Lift Every Voice and Sing, and his brother, Rosamond Johnson. They were both producing hits on Broadway in the 1920s, drawing on this culture. Zora Neale Hurston, who is really, along with DuBose Hayward, I would say they are the two most important people in putting the whole story together, understanding starting with the music, and through a study of the music, being able to make connections to Africa and African cultural practices. Zora Neale Hurston, of course, is a trained anthropologist. So her observations on the culture are, of course, far more critically informed and important to the work of later generations than DuBose Hayward's are. This whole story of this period from the 1920s to the 1940s sets us up for the 60s and 70s and for later exploration. So basically what I was trying to do was create a basis for understanding among scholars from different disciplines, because in order to tell this story, you have to talk about the visual art, you have to talk about the music, you have to talk about language, linguistics, as well as novels.
And you have to talk about religion.
And you have to talk about religion, right? Yes, thank you.
I want to get back to DuBose Hayward, who I think is arguably the best known of the writers.
Yes.
He didn't win the Pulitzer Prize. Julia Peterkin did. And do you know that Scarlet Sister Mary, when it came out, won the Pulitzer Prize, that it was banned in certain South Carolina counties?
Now, I did not know that.
Yes.
But I'm not surprised by that because, it is about sex.
Yeah. Yes.
It's about a woman having, lots of children and not being ashamed, of who she is. So I'm sure that would have been controversial.
Well, Julia Peterkin and DuBose Hayward both had works that appeared in Broadway. Peterkin's, it was Scarlet Sister Mary.
Yes.
On Broadway in blackface.
With the Barrymores. Ethel Barrymore.
Really?
Which is insane. Ethel Barrymore in blackface. It's mind-blowing.
Yeah.
And actually, I'm surprised that Peterkin, with her connections in New York, put up with that. But anyway, it was not a very successful play.
No.
But Porgy and then Mamba's Daughters, both by Hayward, were with black actors. In fact, Ethel Waters,
that's right, yes.
Mamba's Daughters, really put her on the map.
Yes, she wanted to make the transition to serious, and that to serious acting, and that was a juicy role. The role of the mother in Mamba's Daughters was transformative for her. She got a lot more movie work after that.
Okay, all right, Kendra. Alfred's giving me the wind-up sign. Any last words for our listeners?
Well, I hope you found it fun, right? What I wanted to do, it's a very serious story. There are parts of it that are challenging and very difficult to read. But then there is so much about it. The personalities are so fascinating. And the things that they did, to strike our modern sensibilities is actually hilarious in some senses. So I tried to convey that this material was fun to explore.
Well, you sent me to my South Carolina bookshelf. Seriously, I had so much fun. I felt like I was back in graduate school.
Oh, God.
No, seriously.
But in a good way, hopefully.
In a good way.
That's a good thing then, right?
It's a good thing.
Okay.
I did go pull down. I do have a copy of the script for Mamba's Daughters.
Oh, God, I would love to see that.
You made me do it. I had to. But what I also did is I opened my copy of Jonathan Green's Gullah Spirit.
Yes.
And he asked me to write a little introductory essay, and I entitled it The Carolina Lowcountry, Elegy or Ode. Oh. And your argument is the people from the 20s and 30s, they were elegies for a dying society. Green's work is a hymn of praise for the same period.
And a living society,
yes.
A living, breathing, constantly transforming, society. And so, yes, I love that. I think that's beautiful.
Yeah.
And I do think that that Jonathan Green is definitely one of the people I want to write about.
Yeah.
His body of work is very important and needs to be, we need a proper understanding of it.
And he is an incredible human being.
He is. He is.
Very generous with his talents. Professor Kendra Hamilton, thank you so much for being with us today on The Journal.
Dr. Edgar, what a privilege it's been to be with you.
This has been so much fun.
It has been fun.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation today. I know that I did. By giving voice to artists and culture makers on both sides of the color line, uncovering buried histories, and revealing secret connections between races amid official practices of Jim Crow, Kendra Hamilton's Romancing the Gullah in the Age of Porgy and Bess sheds new light on an only partially told tale. It's a book that will satisfy the book lover and the scholar.
Walter Edgar's Journal is a production of South Carolina Public Radio. I'm Alfred Turner, and I produce the show, which is made possible by listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. Remember, the views and opinions expressed on Walter Edgar's Journal are not necessarily those of South Carolina Public Radio or its underwriters.
New episodes of Walter Edgar's Journal are published on the first and third Fridays of the month and are available at southcarolinapublicradio.org, on the SCETV app, as well as your favorite podcast provider. We'll talk again soon.